Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
My American dream started with silence. Do you remember the moment you realized that your voice had abandoned you? Not because you had nothing to say, but because the words refused to come out in a language that anyone could understand. I remember mine vividly. It was a gray morning at JFK Airport in New York, my first day in America, and I was standing in front of a customs officer who was asking me a question. A simple question. I had practiced it 100 times on the plane. What is the purpose of your visit? But when I opened my mouth, nothing came out. Not a word. Not a sound. Just the hum of the airport around me and the impatient tapping of the officer's pen on the counter. He asked again, slower this time, with a tone that made me feel like a criminal. And still, I couldn't speak. My brain had shut down. The words were there, somewhere in the back of my mind, but they were trapped behind a wall of fear that I had never known existed until that exact moment. I nodded. I smiled. I handed him my documents with shaking hands, and somehow he let me through. But I walked out of that airport carrying a heavy, suffocating shame that would follow me for years. I had come to America with big dreams, a new husband, and a belief that anything was possible. But in that first encounter, I learned something that would define my early years in this country. My voice didn't matter here. My words didn't count. And if I couldn't speak, I couldn't exist. That experience at the airport set the tone for everything that followed. I arrived in my new home in Ohio, a small apartment that smelled like someone else's life, and I realized that I had left more than my country behind. I had left my ability to be heard. I could no longer tell a joke, express an opinion, or even ask for directions without feeling a wave of panic wash over me. My husband, who had been in the U.S. for years, took care of everything. The bills, the phone calls, the conversations with the landlord. And I let him, not because I was lazy, but because I was terrified. Every time I tried to speak, I heard the customs officer's impatient voice in my head. Every time I made a mistake, I felt the eyes of strangers boring into my back, judging me, dismissing me. So I stopped trying. I retreated into silence. I became the quiet wife, the docile immigrant, the woman who smiled and nodded and said nothing. And somewhere along the way, I started to believe that I had nothing worth saying anyway. My English was bad. My accent was ugly. My thoughts were too complicated to translate. So why bother? Why embarrass myself? Why risk being seen as stupid or incompetent? It was easier to just disappear. And disappear I did, behind a mask of politeness that said, I'm fine when I was drowning, that said, I understand when I understood nothing, that said, yes, when every fiber of my being wanted to scream no. I got my first job 6 months after arriving. A restaurant. Not a fancy one. A diner on the outskirts of town where the customers were mostly truck drivers and the tips were mostly coins. I worked in the kitchen, washing dishes, peeling potatoes, mopping floors. It was hard work, but I didn't mind the hard work. What I minded was the humiliation. The cooks would yell at me in rapid English, and I would nod and smile and have no idea what they were saying. They would ask me for something, and I would hand them the wrong thing. They would laugh, and I would pretend not to notice. One day, I was carrying a pot of hot oil across the kitchen when I slipped. The oil splashed onto my arm, and the pain was so sudden and so sharp that I screamed. But I didn't scream, ouch, or help, or anything that anyone could understand. I screamed in Vietnamese. A sound so foreign and so raw that the entire kitchen stopped and stared at me. And in that moment, I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. I was surrounded by people, but I was completely invisible. They couldn't hear me. They couldn't understand me. And I couldn't explain. I couldn't say I'm hurt, or I need help, or even please. I just stood there, holding my burned arm, tears streaming down my face, and the only thing I could do was smile apologetically. Because that's what I had learned to do. Apologize for my existence. Apologize for my pain. Apologize for not being able to speak the language of my new country. That night, I went home and locked myself in the bathroom. I looked at the burn on my arm, red and angry, and I thought about all the other burns I had been collecting. The emotional burns. The invisible ones. The ones that came from being ignored, dismissed, treated like I didn't matter. And I asked myself the question that would echo through the next several years of my life. Why did I come here? What was I thinking? Who am I in this country where I don't even have a voice? I didn't have an answer. Not then. But that question planted a seed. A tiny, stubborn seed that would eventually grow into something unexpected. It took years. It took pain. It took more tears than I thought I had left. But eventually, that seed would blossom into the realization that my voice had never really left me. It was just buried. Buried under fear and shame and the false belief that I needed to be fluent to be heard. And when I finally started digging it up, word by broken word, I discovered that my voice was stronger than I had ever imagined. Not because it was perfect, but because it was mine. Do you know what I realized in that bathroom with my burned arm and my tear-streaked face? I realized that my silence wasn't protecting me. It was imprisoning me. Every time I chose not to speak, I was choosing to stay small. I was choosing to stay invisible. I was choosing to let my fear win. And I was tired of losing. So I made a decision. A quiet, private decision that nobody else would ever know about. I decided that I would learn English. Not for my husband. Not for my job. Not to impress anyone. I would learn it for me. I would learn it because I refused to spend the rest of my life apologizing for my existence. I would learn it because I had something to say. I just had to find the words. And that, my friend, is where this story really begins. Not with the customs officer. Not with the burned arm. Not with the shame. But with the moment I decided that I mattered enough to be heard. Even if my English was broken. Even if my voice shook. Even if nobody was listening, I was going to speak anyway. And that decision, as small and insignificant as it seemed, would change absolutely everything. My first job was a humiliation. Picture this. You are standing in a kitchen so hot and loud that you can barely hear your own thoughts. Steam rises from giant pots of boiling water. The chef is screaming something in a language that sounds like English but moves too fast for your brain to catch. You are holding a stack of plates so heavy that your arms are shaking. You are sweating. You are terrified. And you have no idea what anyone is saying to you. That was my life for the first 2 years in America. Every single day. I had come to this country with a university degree, years of professional experience, and a head full of dreams. But none of that mattered in the kitchen of a diner where the only question anyone ever asked me was, "Can you work fast?" And I would nod and smile and say yes, because that was the only English word I could trust. I couldn't say, "I'm tired." I couldn't say, "I'm scared." I couldn't say, "My back hurts from standing for 12 hours." I just nodded and smiled and kept working because that was the only way I knew how to survive. But survival is not living. And deep down, I knew that. I knew that every day I spent in that kitchen was another day I was losing myself. Another day I was proving to the world and to myself that I didn't matter, that my voice wasn't worth hearing, that my broken English was a sign of my worthlessness, not just a temporary phase in my immigrant journey. Let me tell you about the worst day. It was a Tuesday, I think. It was always a Tuesday when bad things happened. The lunch rush was in full swing. The kitchen was chaos. Orders were piling up. The chef was screaming louder than usual, and I was trying to carry a giant pot of soup from the stove to the counter. It was heavy, it was hot, and I was exhausted. I had been working since 5 a.m. I hadn't eaten, I hadn't sat down, and my body was giving up. I felt my knees buckle, just for a second, but that second was all it took. The pot slipped from my hands and crashed to the floor. Hot soup splashed everywhere. On my shoes, on my legs, on my hands. The pain was instant and unbearable. I screamed. But my scream was in Vietnamese, a desperate, guttural sound that didn't even sound like me. And when I opened my eyes, I saw everyone staring at me. The chef was furious. The waitresses were annoyed. The other kitchen staff were laughing. Not a mean laugh, exactly. More like a laugh of relief that it wasn't them. But it didn't matter. It felt mean. It felt like the world was laughing at me and my brokenness and my inability to even scream in the right language. I stood there, covered in hot soup, tears streaming down my face, and I wanted to disappear. I wanted to evaporate into the steam rising from the giant pots. I wanted to be anywhere but in that kitchen, in that body, in that country where I had no voice and no value. That night, after my shift, I went home and sat on the floor of my tiny apartment. The burn on my hand was red and swelling. But I didn't put anything on it. I didn't even feel the pain. I was too busy feeling something worse.
Shame.
A shame so deep and so raw that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only replay the scene in my head over and over again. The crash, the scream, the laughter, the silence. And I asked myself, why are you here? Why are you putting yourself through this? You're smart. You are capable. You have a degree. You have experience. You have so much to offer. And yet you're washing dishes in a diner where nobody even knows your name. The answer was simple and devastating. I was there because I couldn't speak English. I couldn't find a better job because I couldn't communicate. I couldn't communicate because I was afraid. And I was afraid because I had convinced myself that my accent was a disease, that my mistakes were evidence of my incompetence, that my broken English meant I was broken as a person. I had built a prison in my own mind, and I was the only one who could tear it down.
But I didn't know how.
I didn't have the keys. I didn't have the strength. All I had was shame and a burn on my hand and a heart so full of regret that I thought it would burst. I cried that night. Not the quiet, dignified tears of a woman who is trying to be strong. The ugly, messy, gasping sobs of someone who has given up. I cried until I had no tears left. And then I lay on the floor and stared at the ceiling. And in the silence, a thought emerged. It was a quiet thought, barely a whisper. But it was there. It said, you can stay here and cry forever. Or you can get up tomorrow and try again. And I realized something. I had been trying to learn English the wrong way. I had been treating it like a test, like something I had to pass, like something that would prove my worth. And because I couldn't pass it perfectly, I had given up. I had stopped trying. I had retreated into silence. But what if I tried a different way? What if I treated English not as a test, but as a tool? What if I stopped worrying about being perfect and just focused on being understood? What if I made mistakes on purpose, just to prove to myself that they didn't kill me? And what if, instead of hiding from my accent, I embraced it? What if I told myself that my accent was not a sign of failure, but a badge of honor? A reminder that I had come to a new country, left everything behind, and was brave enough to try. That thought changed everything. It didn't make the fear disappear. It didn't make the shame vanish. But it gave me a tiny spark of hope. And a spark, as small as it is, can light a fire. I started small. The next day at work, I wrote down a few simple phrases on a piece of paper. Can you show me? Where is the? Please repeat that. I kept the paper in my pocket, and when I didn't understand something, I pulled it out and pointed to the phrase. It was embarrassing. It felt like admitting defeat. But it worked.
People started to understand me.
They started to slow down. They started to help. And slowly, I started to feel less invisible. I started to feel like a person again. Not a perfect person. Not a fluent person. But a person who was trying. And trying, I realized, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Because trying meant I hadn't given up. Trying meant I still believed I mattered. Trying meant I was still alive. And as long as I was alive, I had a chance. A chance to learn. A chance to grow. A chance to find my voice. And that chance, as small as it was the most precious thing I had. That kitchen job was humiliating. It was exhausting. It was soul-crushing in ways I still struggle to describe. But it was also the place where I learned the most important lesson of my life. I learned that my voice had not abandoned me. I had abandoned it. I had silenced myself because I was afraid of what others would think. I had muted my own soul because I didn't believe I was worthy of being heard. And that realization, as painful as it was also liberating, because it meant I had the power to change things. I could unsilence myself. I could speak, even when my voice shook. I could make mistakes and survive. I could be imperfect and still be valuable. And that is a lesson that changed my life forever. Not just my English. My entire life. Falling in love without words. Love, they say, is a universal language. But what happens when you don't even have the words to say, I love you in the language of the person you're falling for? What happens when your heart is full to bursting, but your mouth refuses to cooperate? What happens when you want to tell someone that they make you feel alive, but all you can say is, you good? I met him at the library. Not a romantic setting, I know, but that's where it happened. I was looking for a book, something simple, something with pictures, something I could actually understand, when I saw him sitting in the corner, reading a novel and smiling. Not a big smile. A small one. A private smile, like he was sharing a secret with the author. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A flutter. A spark. A tiny, terrifying flicker of hope. I didn't know his name. I didn't know anything about him. But I knew I wanted to talk to him. I wanted to hear his voice. I wanted to see if he would smile at me the way he was smiling at that book. And I was terrified. Not because I was shy. I had never been shy. I was terrified because I didn't have the words. I didn't have the vocabulary to introduce myself. I didn't have the grammar to ask a question. I didn't have the confidence to say anything at all. So I did what I always did. I walked past him, pretending not to notice, and I sat down at a table far away, where I could watch him from a distance without being seen. It was pathetic. It was cowardly. But it was also the only thing I knew how to do. The next week he was there again. Same corner. Same book. Same smile. And this time, I made a decision. I was going to speak to him. Not because I was brave. Not because I had suddenly become fluent. But because I was tired of running away. Tired of hiding. Tired of letting my fear win. I walked over to his table, my heart pounding so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. I opened my mouth to speak, and nothing came out. The words were there, somewhere in the back of my mind, but they were trapped behind a wall of panic that I couldn't break through. He looked up at me, curious, patient. He said, "Can I help you?" And I felt the familiar wave of shame rising. I wanted to run away. I wanted to disappear. But something in his eyes stopped me. Something kind. Something gentle. Something that said, "It's okay."
Take your time.
And so I took a breath. A deep, shaky breath. And I said, I am learning.
English.
I want, talk you. Simple words. Broken grammar. Terrible pronunciation. But they were my words.
And he understood them.
He smiled. Not the way people smile when they're mocking you, but the way people smile when they genuinely care. He said, "That's beautiful. Your English is beautiful.
Keep going.
And in that moment, I fell in love. Not with him. Not yet. I fell in love with the idea that I could be seen. That I could be heard. That my broken sentences didn't make me invisible. They made me human. We started talking every week. He would sit in his corner, and I would sit across from him, and we would talk about everything and nothing. Books, movies, food, our childhoods, our dreams. I made mistakes. I made a lot of mistakes. I mixed up bored and boring. I said, "I am full of soup," when I meant, "I am full after the soup." I told him I was excited to eat my children, instead of excited to eat with my children. And each time he would laugh. Not at me. With me. He would gently correct me, not in a condescending way, but in a way that felt like a gift. It's "I am bored," not "I am boring." You're not boring. You're the most interesting person I know. And I would blush and repeat the correction, and we would move on. He never made me feel ashamed of my English. He never made me feel like I was less than him because I couldn't speak perfectly. He just accepted me as I was. Broken sentences and all. And that acceptance, that unconditional acceptance, was the most healing thing I had ever experienced. It was proof that I didn't need to be perfect to be loved. It was proof that I was enough, exactly as I was. We started dating. Not officially. It just kind of happened. We would meet at the library, then we would go for coffee, then we would take walks in the park. He would talk and I would listen. I would try to respond, and he would wait patiently while I searched for the right words. Sometimes I would find them. Sometimes I wouldn't. Sometimes I would just smile and nod, and that was enough. He understood. He always understood. And I realized, for the first time in my life, that love doesn't require perfect English. Love requires presence. Love requires patience. Love requires the willingness to be vulnerable, even when you're scared of being judged. And he was the first person who made me feel safe enough to be vulnerable. The first person who didn't make me feel like my accent was a liability. The first person who saw me, not as an immigrant with broken English, but as a woman with a beautiful soul and a story worth telling. One evening, we were sitting on a park bench, watching the sunset, and he turned to me and said, "I love you." And I froze. Not because I didn't feel the same way. I did. I had fallen in love with him weeks ago, but I didn't know how to say it back. I was afraid of getting the words wrong. I was afraid of ruining the moment. I was afraid that my broken English would somehow make the words less true. But then I looked into his eyes, and I saw the same fear, the same vulnerability, reflected back at me. And I realized that love transcends language. It transcends grammar. It transcends pronunciation. It transcends every mistake I could ever make. So I took a breath and said the words, exactly as I had practiced them in my head 1,000 times. I love you too. Simple. Imperfect. Perfect. And he kissed me, and the world melted away. And in that moment, I knew that I had finally found something I had been looking for my whole life. Not just love, but acceptance. The knowledge that I was worthy of being loved, not despite my imperfections, but because of them. Our relationship grew slowly, gently, like a flower blooming in the spring. He taught me new words. I taught him about my culture. We laughed together. We cried together. We built a life together. And my English continued to improve, not because I was studying harder, but because I was finally relaxing. I was finally letting go of the fear that had held me back for so long. I was finally allowing myself to be seen. And that, my friend, is the most beautiful thing about love. It doesn't just make you feel good. It makes you feel brave. It gives you the courage to be yourself, even when yourself is imperfect. It gives you the strength to keep going, even when things are hard. It gives you the voice you thought you had lost. And it reminds you that you are enough, exactly as you are. My marriage was my crutch. Let me tell you something that took me years to admit. I didn't just marry my ex-husband because I loved him. I married him because he could speak English. That sounds terrible, I know. It sounds like I used him. And maybe, in some ways, I did. But it wasn't intentional. It wasn't calculated. It was just survival. When you arrive in a new country, terrified and alone, you cling to anyone who can help you navigate the chaos. And he was my navigator. He made the phone calls. He filled out the forms. He talked to the landlord, the bank, the insurance company. He did all the things that required English, and I did all the things that didn't. I cooked. I cleaned. I took care of our home. It was a division of labor that made sense on the surface. But underneath, it was something much darker. It was a division of power. And I had given him all of it, not because he asked for it, but because I was too afraid to keep any for myself. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that once I learned English, I would take back my share. But the months turned into years, and my English didn't improve. Not because I wasn't trying, but because I wasn't practicing. I was letting him do all the speaking, and in doing so, I was letting my voice atrophy. Like a muscle you never use. Like a language you never speak. I was slowly, quietly disappearing. The worst part was that I didn't even notice it happening. It was so gradual, so insidious, that I woke up one day and realized I had become a completely different person. The woman who had been confident, outspoken, and independent in her home country was gone. In her place was a woman who nodded and smiled and said nothing. A woman who deferred to her husband in every decision. A woman who had convinced herself that her opinions didn't matter because she couldn't express them in English. And my husband, to his credit, didn't try to silence me. He never told me to shut up. He never made me feel small. But he also didn't notice that I was shrinking. He was too busy with his own life, his own career, his own American dream. And I was just there. In the background. A supporting character in my own story. I remember one night, we were having dinner with some of his colleagues. They were all native English speakers, successful professionals with impressive jobs and impressive vocabularies. And I sat there, smiling and nodding, pretending to understand conversations that were way over my head. At one point, one of them turned to me and asked a question. Something about my job, my interests, my life. And I froze. I had no idea what to say. I had no idea how to answer. So I looked at my husband and I said, "You tell them." And he did. He answered for me. He told them about my life, my interests, my job. And I just sat there, silent and invisible, feeling my sense of self crumble into dust. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in my head. And I realized something that shook me to my core. I had become a ghost. I was haunting my own life, watching it from the outside, unable to participate. I had given my voice away, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. And the worst part was, I didn't even know how to get it back. I had been silent for so long that I had forgotten how to speak. I had been invisible for so long that I had forgotten how to be seen. I had let my husband become my crutch, and in doing so, I had crippled myself. I was dependent on him for everything, not just for English, but for my identity, for my sense of self-worth, for my belief that I mattered. And that dependency, that unhealthy, soul-crushing dependency, was destroying me, not because he was a bad person. He wasn't. But because I had handed him all the power and I had none left for myself. It took me a long time to understand that my marriage wasn't just a partnership. It was a cage. A beautiful, comfortable, well-intentioned cage, but a cage nonetheless. And I was the one who had locked myself inside. I had chosen silence over struggle. I had chosen invisibility over effort. I had chosen the easy path of letting someone else speak for me, rather than the hard path of finding my own voice. And I was paying the price. Every day, in small, invisible ways that added up to a life that wasn't really mine. I started to resent my husband, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he had what I didn't. A voice, a presence, a sense of belonging. And I hated myself for resenting him. I hated myself for being so weak. I hated myself for being so afraid. And that self-hatred, that toxic, corrosive self-hatred, was the final nail in the coffin of my marriage. I remember the moment I realized I had to change. It was a Sunday morning. My husband was reading the newspaper, and I was making breakfast.
And I said something to him.
I don't remember what. Something simple. Something about the weather, or the grocery list, or the kids.
But he didn't hear me.
He was too absorbed in his newspaper. And I felt a rage, so sudden and so sharp that it took my breath away. Not rage at him. Rage at myself. For being so invisible that I could be standing right in front of him, and he wouldn't even notice I was there. For being so silent that my words had become background noise. For being so dependent on him that I had forgotten how to exist on my own. And in that moment I knew that I had to find my voice. Not for him, not for our marriage, but for me. I had to learn to speak English, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to exist. I wanted to be seen. I wanted to matter. And I couldn't do that if I was hiding behind someone else's words. So, I made a decision. A quiet, private decision that I didn't tell anyone about. I decided that I would start speaking English. Not perfectly, not fluently, but regularly. I would practice. I would make mistakes. I would embarrass myself. And I would keep going. Because the alternative was worse. The alternative was disappearing entirely. And I wasn't ready to disappear. Not yet. Not while I still had a fight left in me. That decision was the beginning of the end of my marriage. Not because I wanted to leave him, but because I wanted to find myself. And somewhere along the way, I realized that the person I was becoming didn't fit into the cage I had built for myself. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't mine. It was just time. Time to move on. Time to grow. Time to become the person I had always been meant to be. A person with a voice. A person with a presence. A person who could stand on her own 2 feet and say, I am here. I exist. I matter. And that person, that brave, imperfect, beautiful person, was worth fighting for. The divorce that broke me open. The divorce didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, over months and years of silence and resentment and the slow erosion of everything we had built together. But when it finally came, it came like a hurricane.
Fast. Fierce.
Devastating. I remember the day he told me he wanted to leave.
It was a Tuesday because of course it was a Tuesday.
We were sitting in our living room, the same living room where we had celebrated our first anniversary, where we had watched our children take their first steps, where we had dreamed about the future we would build together. And he said, I can't do this anymore. I asked him what he meant. I didn't understand. I thought we were fine. I thought we were just going through a rough patch. But he said, I don't love you anymore. I haven't loved you for a long time. I'm sorry. And just like that, my world fell apart. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there, frozen, staring at him like he was a stranger. And in a way, he was. The man I had married, the man I had crossed an ocean for, the man I had given up my country and my career and my identity for, was gone. In his place was a stranger who was telling me that our life together was over. And I had no words. No words to fight back. No words to explain. No words to beg. Just silence. The same silence that had defined our marriage was now defining its end. And I hated myself for it. I hated myself for being so weak. I hated myself for letting him do all the speaking, for letting him have all the power, for letting him decide the fate of our family without so much as a word from me. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork and tears and sleepless nights. I moved out of our house with nothing but a few suitcases and a broken heart. My children, confused and scared, clung to me as we drove to our new apartment. A tiny, dingy place with thin walls and a leaking faucet and a view of a parking lot. It was a far cry from the beautiful home we had shared. But it was mine. And in a strange way, that felt like a victory. Not a big one. Not a triumphant one. But a victory nonetheless. I was on my own. I had no husband.
No translator. No crutch.
Just me, 2 children, and a language I could barely speak. And the terror of that reality was so overwhelming that I couldn't breathe. I would wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, convinced I was dying. But I wasn't dying. I was just panicking. And panic, as I would learn, is not a death sentence. It's just your body's way of telling you that something needs to change. And everything needed to change. Everything. I started looking for a job. Not a kitchen job this time. Something better. Something that would allow me to support my children and rebuild my life. But every application required English. Every interview required English. Every phone call required English. And I was terrified. I would practice my answers in the mirror over and over until I could say them without stumbling. But when I got to the actual interview, my mind would go blank. I would forget the words. I would mix up the tenses. I would freeze. And the interviewer would smile politely and say, "Thank you for coming. We'll be in touch." And I would walk out of that office, knowing that I had failed. Not because I wasn't qualified. I was. But because I couldn't speak the language. Because I couldn't express my skills and experience in the one language that mattered in this country. And that failure, that repeated, humiliating failure, was the most demoralizing thing I had ever experienced. I started to believe that I would never find a job, that I would never be able to support my children, that I would never be able to build a life for us in this country. And that belief, that deep, corrosive belief, was almost worse than the divorce itself. But something happened in the depths of that despair. Something unexpected. Something miraculous. I realized that I had been defining myself by my failures. I had been letting the divorce, the job rejections, the language barriers define who I was. And I was tired of it. I was tired of being a victim. I was tired of feeling sorry for myself. I was tired of letting fear control my life. And so I made a decision. A radical, terrifying, life-changing decision. I decided that I would stop trying to be perfect. I would stop trying to be fluent. I would stop trying to be anything other than what I was. A woman who was learning. A woman who was struggling. A woman who was trying her best, even when her best wasn't good enough. And I started speaking. Not perfectly,
Not fluently, but regularly.
I spoke to my children in English, even when they laughed at my accent. I spoke to my neighbors, even when I didn't understand everything they said. I spoke to strangers, even when I was terrified of being judged. And slowly, painfully slowly, something started to shift. The fear started to fade. The shame started to dissolve. And the words started to come. Not all at once. Not in perfect sentences. But they came. And they kept coming. And with each word, I felt myself becoming stronger, braver, more alive. I was no longer a silent victim of my divorce. I was a survivor, a fighter, a woman who was rebuilding her life, one broken sentence at a time. And that, my friend, is a beautiful thing. Looking back, I can see that the divorce didn't break me. It broke open the version of me that was too afraid to speak. It shattered the cage I had built for myself. It forced me to find my voice, not despite the pain, but because of it. And that voice, as imperfect as it was, became my greatest strength. It became the tool I used to rebuild my life, to support my children, to connect with the world around me. It became the thing that set me free. So if you're going through something similar, if you're struggling with divorce or loss or any of the other challenges that life throws at you,
I want you to know something.
you are not alone. You are not broken. You are not a failure. You are a human being doing the best you can with what you have.
And that is enough.
That is more than enough. That is everything. My children became my translators. There is a moment in every parent's life when you realize that your child has become more capable than you. It's a beautiful moment usually, a moment of pride, a moment of joy, a moment when you see the incredible person they are becoming. But for me, that moment was not beautiful. It was devastating. It happened at the pediatrician's office.
My daughter was 6 years old at the time.
She had a bad cough, a persistent one that had been keeping her up at night. I was worried, so I took her to the doctor. I sat in the waiting room, rehearsing what I would say. My daughter has a cough. She can't sleep. She needs medicine. Simple words. Simple sentences. I had practiced them 50 times on the way there. But when the doctor walked into the room, something happened. Something that always happened when I was under pressure. My mind went blank. The words disappeared. I opened my mouth and nothing came out.
Just a sound.
A pathetic, strained sound that wasn't a word in any language. The doctor looked at me, confused. He asked me a question, and I couldn't understand it. I felt the familiar panic rising in my chest, the heat spreading across my face, the shame crashing over me like a wave. And then, my 6-year-old daughter looked up at the doctor and said, "My mom's English isn't very good. She's still learning. I can translate." And she did. She told the doctor about her cough, about her sleepless nights, about the medicine she needed. She spoke clearly, confidently, like a tiny adult. And I sat there, frozen, watching my 6-year-old daughter speak for me. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Because her mother was too afraid, too ashamed, too broken to do it herself. And in that moment, I felt a shame so deep and so raw that I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. That was the moment I realized the true cost of my silence. It wasn't just my loss. It was my children's loss. They were losing their mother. Not to death, not to distance, but to fear. They were losing the woman who was supposed to protect them, advocate for them, be their rock. Instead, they were becoming my protectors, my advocates, my rocks. And that wasn't fair. It wasn't fair to them. It wasn't fair to me. It wasn't fair to anyone. So, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of our lives. I decided that I would never let my children translate for me again. Not because I was ashamed of them, but because I was ashamed of myself. I was ashamed of being so weak that my 6-year-old had to fight my battles. I was ashamed of being so afraid that my daughter had to be the adult. And I was determined to change. Not overnight, not easily, but I would change. I would learn English. Not for me, not for my husband, not for my career, for my children, so that they could be children again, so that they could be protected instead of protecting, so that they could have a mother who could stand up for them, speak for them, be their voice when they needed one. I started learning English in a completely new way. I stopped studying grammar. I stopped memorizing vocabulary lists. I started listening, really listening, to my children, to my neighbors, to the conversations around me at the grocery store, at the park, at the library. I would sit and listen not to understand everything, but to absorb the rhythm, the flow, the music of the language. I would repeat phrases under my breath, over and over, until they felt less foreign in my mouth. I would ask my children to teach me words, not because they were my translators, but because they were my teachers. And they loved it. They loved being the experts for a change. They loved seeing their mother try, even when she failed. They loved being part of my journey, not as my crutches, but as my companions. And that partnership, that beautiful, unexpected partnership, transformed our relationship in ways I never could have imagined. We became closer. We laughed more. We shared more. And my English improved not because I was studying harder, but because I was communicating more. Because I was connecting with the people I loved most in the world. And that connection, that deep, genuine connection, was the best language teacher I could ever have asked for. One evening, my daughter came home from school and told me about a girl in her class who was being bullied because she was an immigrant. She doesn't speak English very well, my daughter said. And the kids make fun of her. I looked at my daughter, and I saw the pain in her eyes. Pain for her friend. Pain for the injustice of it all. And I knew what I had to do. I went to the school the next day. Not as a silent immigrant. Not as a woman who needed her daughter to translate. As a mother. A fierce, determined mother who was ready to fight for her child's friend. I walked into the principal's office, my heart pounding, my palms sweating. And I spoke. Not perfectly. Not fluently. But I spoke. I told the principal what my daughter had told me. I told her that bullying was unacceptable. I told her that I expected the school to do something about it. And when I was done, the principal looked at me and said, "Thank you for coming. I'll take care of it." And she did. The bullying stopped. The girl made new friends. And my daughter looked at me with such pride, such admiration, that I almost cried. Not because I had done something heroic, but because I had done something simple. I had spoken up. I had used my voice. And in doing so, I had shown my daughter that her mother was not weak. That her mother could fight. That her mother could be the protector, not the protected. And that was the most important lesson I could ever teach her. From that day on, I stopped being afraid of my accent. I stopped being afraid of my mistakes. I stopped being afraid of being judged. I spoke, not perfectly, but bravely. I made mistakes, but I laughed at them. I stumbled, but I got back up. And my children watched me. They watched me struggle and fail and try again. And in watching me, they learned something invaluable. They learned that resilience is possible. That failure is not the end. That growth is always within reach. And that lesson, more than any English word I could ever teach them, is the greatest gift I will ever give them. They now have a mother who is strong, who is brave, who is not afraid to be imperfect. They have a mother who shows them that life is not about avoiding challenges. It's about facing them head on and growing through them. And that's a lesson that will serve them for the rest of their lives. So if you're watching this and you're struggling with English or with divorce or with any of the other challenges that life throws at you, I want you to know something. You are not alone. You are not weak. You are not a failure. You are a human being doing the best you can with what you have.
And that is enough.
That is more than enough. That is everything. The coffee shop miracle. I found the coffee shop by accident. Or maybe it found me. I was walking aimlessly through the streets of Columbus, trying to escape the suffocating silence of my apartment, when I turned a corner and saw it. A small, unassuming cafe tucked between a laundromat and a used bookstore. The sign above the door said The Daily Grind, and for some reason, I felt drawn to it. Maybe it was the warm glow of the lights inside. Maybe it was the sound of jazz music drifting through the half-open door. Or maybe it was just the desperate need to be somewhere that wasn't my tiny apartment, where the walls seemed to close in on me every night. I pushed open the door, and a little bell chimed above my head. The smell of fresh coffee hit me like a wave of comfort, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. I ordered a tea because I didn't know how to order coffee, and I found a small table in the corner, tucked away from the other customers. And I sat there, sipping my tea, listening to conversations I couldn't fully understand, and feeling strangely safe. Nobody was looking at me. Nobody was waiting for me to speak. Nobody was judging my accent or my grammar or my broken sentences. I was invisible, and for once, that felt like a gift. I started going back to that coffee shop every day, not to study, not to practice, just to be. I would bring a book or my notebook or sometimes nothing at all. I would sit in my corner and listen. I listened to the baristas taking orders. I listened to the customers chatting with each other. I listened to the rhythm of the language, the way the words flowed together, the way people emphasized certain sounds and softened others. I wasn't trying to understand everything. I was just letting the language wash over me like music. And slowly, something started to shift. The sounds that had once felt so foreign started to feel familiar. The words that had once blurred together started to separate into distinct pieces. I started to recognize patterns, repetitions, common phrases that people used over and over again. Can I get a? I'll have the. How are you doing today? Have a good one. Simple phrases, repeated hundreds of times a day. And without even trying, without any flashcards or grammar drills, I started to absorb them. My brain was learning English in the background while I was just sitting there, drinking tea, being a quiet observer. It reminded me of something I had read about language acquisition. Children don't learn languages by studying grammar books. They learn by being immersed in the language, by hearing it over and over again, by being surrounded by it in a low-pressure environment where they can just absorb it naturally. And that's exactly what was happening to me in that coffee shop. I was creating a low-pressure environment for my brain to do what it was designed to do. Learn without fear. Learn without judgment. Learn through curiosity and repetition, and the simple joy of understanding something new. I started going to the coffee shop earlier in the morning when it was quiet and empty. I would order my tea, sit in my corner, and listen. I would watch the baristas prepare drinks, noticing how they called out names and orders. I would watch the customers interact, noticing how they asked for things, how they made small talk, how they said goodbye. And I would repeat the phrases to myself under my breath when nobody was listening. Good morning. Can I have a latte? Thank you. Have a nice day. Over and over, until the words felt less foreign in my mouth. It was the first time I had practiced English without feeling anxious. The first time I had spoken the language without my heart racing. The first time I had felt like maybe, just maybe, I could do this. One day, something unexpected happened. The barista, a young woman with bright pink hair and a warm smile, called out my order and said, I see you here every day. You're a regular now. I froze.
She was talking to me.
She was waiting for a response, and I felt the familiar panic rising in my chest. But then I took a breath and remembered what I had been practicing. I smiled and said, "Yes. I like your coffee shop. Very nice. Simple. Imperfect. But real." She smiled back and said, "That's sweet. Where are you from?" And I told her.
Vietnam.
I told her I was from Vietnam, and she asked me about the food, and I told her about pho and banh mi, and she said she had always wanted to visit. We had a conversation. A real conversation. Not long, not deep, but real. And I survived. I didn't freeze. I didn't run away. I just talked, made mistakes, and moved on. I left that coffee shop feeling like I had climbed another mountain. But this one was different. This one didn't feel like a battle. It felt like a connection. That coffee shop became my sanctuary. Every day, I would go and practice my listening. I would pay attention to how people started conversations, how they ended them, how they expressed agreement or disagreement. I would notice the small phrases that native speakers used, the ones that weren't in textbooks. "I'm good, you?" "Yeah, totally." "No way." I started writing them down in a notebook I kept in my bag, not to memorize them, just to notice them, to train my ear to recognize them. And slowly, I started to feel more comfortable with the sounds of the language. The words that had once felt like a jumble of noise started to form into patterns. The sentences that had once felt like a wall started to reveal their structure. I was still far from fluent. I still made mistakes. I still had moments of panic when someone spoke too fast or used a word I didn't know. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Not the way I used to be. I had found a safe space to learn, a space where I could make mistakes without feeling ashamed, a space where I could be a beginner without being judged. And that changed everything. I started to realize that language learning isn't about memorizing endless lists of vocabulary or mastering every grammar rule. It's about creating an environment where your brain can do what it naturally does.
Absorb. Adapt. Learn.
And the best environment for learning is one where you feel safe, where you're not constantly worried about being judged, where you can take risks and make mistakes without feeling like a failure. That's what the coffee shop gave me. A safe space to be imperfect. A place where I could practice being a beginner without shame. And that's something I wish every English learner could have. A place where they can just be present, listen, and absorb the language without pressure. It might be a coffee shop or a library or a park bench. It doesn't matter where it is. What matters is that it's a place where you can lower your guard and let the language in. Because that's when the real learning happens. Not when you're forcing it. Not when you're afraid. But when you're relaxed, curious, and open to whatever comes next. And that, my friend, is the miracle I found in that tiny coffee shop. A miracle that changed my life forever. The mirror changed everything. Do you remember the last time you truly looked at yourself in the mirror? Not the quick glance you do before leaving the house to check if your hair is okay, or if you have something stuck in your teeth. I mean, really looked. Stared into your own eyes and saw the person staring back at you. I avoided mirrors for months after my divorce. Not because I was afraid of my reflection, but because I was afraid of what I would see. A woman who had failed. A woman who had been abandoned. A woman who had come to America with big dreams and ended up with nothing but a broken heart and a dictionary she couldn't even use properly. But one morning something shifted. I was brushing my teeth, avoiding my own gaze as I always did, when my daughter walked in and said, "Mom, why don't you ever look at yourself?" It was such an innocent question, asked with the unfiltered honesty of a child, and it hit me like a brick. I put down my toothbrush, looked up, and for the first time in months, I really saw myself. And what I saw wasn't what I expected. I didn't see a failure. I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who had survived something terrible and was still standing. Exhausted, yes. Scared, absolutely. But standing. And in that moment, I realized I had two problems. A broken heart and a broken tongue. One was the result of my marriage ending. The other was the result of letting that ending convince me that I was powerless. But here's the thing about mirrors. They don't lie. They show you exactly what you are, not what you fear you are. And what I saw was a woman who was capable of so much more than she was giving herself credit for. I started talking to myself in the mirror. I know that sounds crazy, but stay with me. Every morning, I would look into my own eyes and say 3 sentences. In English. Slowly. Imperfectly. I am strong enough to learn this language. I am brave enough to make mistakes. I am worthy of being heard. The first week, it felt ridiculous. I would cringe at my own accent, stumble over the words, and feel like a fool. But I kept doing it. Every single day. And something strange started to happen. The words started to feel less foreign. My reflection started to look less like a stranger, and more like someone I recognized. Someone I could trust. I realized that the problem wasn't my ability to learn English. The problem was that I had been treating myself like a student who was failing a test instead of a human being who was learning to live again. I was so focused on getting the grammar right, on pronouncing every syllable perfectly, that I had forgotten the most important part of communication. Connection. Real human connection doesn't require perfect sentences. It requires presence. It requires courage. It requires you to show up and try, even when you're terrified of looking stupid. And that's exactly what I was doing in front of that mirror. I was showing up. I was trying. I was refusing to let my fear win. I remember a particularly difficult morning. I had a parent-teacher conference at my daughter's school, and I was dreading it. I had practiced my questions for hours. How's my daughter doing in math? Is she participating in class? Does she need extra help with anything? But when I sat down in that tiny chair across from the teacher, my mind went completely blank. My heart started racing. My palms started sweating. I could feel the familiar panic rising in my chest. And then I remembered what I had been practicing in the mirror. I took a deep breath, looked the teacher in the eye, and said, "I am learning English. Please be patient with me." And do you know what she did? She smiled warmly and said, "Of course. Take your time. We're on your side." That simple admission, that tiny act of vulnerability, changed everything. The conference went well. I didn't say everything perfectly. I mixed up a few words. I had to ask her to repeat herself twice. But I communicated. I connected. I left that school feeling like I had just won an Olympic medal. And I realized that the fear of being judged is almost always worse than the judgment itself. We imagine people laughing at us, dismissing us, thinking less of us. But most people are kind. Most people are patient. And the ones who aren't? They don't matter. They're not your audience. You're not learning English for them. You're learning it for yourself. For your children. For the life you want to build in this new country. So, I stopped caring about what strangers thought of my accent. I stopped apologizing for being a learner. I started showing up as my imperfect, authentic self. And the world didn't reject me. It welcomed me. I remember another moment that changed everything. I was at a coffee shop, trying to order a latte. I had practiced the word latte over and over. But when I got to the counter, I froze. The barista asked me something I didn't understand. Something about whole milk, or oat milk, or almond milk. I had no idea what he was saying. I could feel the embarrassment creeping up my neck. But instead of running away, I did something different. I smiled and said, "I'm sorry." I'm still learning English. Can you say that again slowly?
And he did.
He smiled, repeated the question slowly, and even pointed to the different milk options on the counter. I ordered my latte, paid, and left. But that moment stayed with me. Because I had been honest about my limitations, and the world had responded with kindness. Not pity, kindness. And that's when I started to understand something essential about language learning. It's not about perfection. It's about connection. It's about being willing to look foolish in front of strangers so that you can eventually speak freely with people who matter. I started applying this lesson to every part of my life. When I went to the grocery store, I stopped pretending to understand things I didn't. I started asking questions. What is this vegetable called? How would you cook this? Is this organic? My questions were simple. My English was still broken, but I was communicating. I was learning. And with every interaction, my confidence grew a little more. I started to realize that the voice in my head, the one that told me I was stupid and incapable, was not the voice of reality. It was the echo of my ex-husband's criticism, the voice of a marriage that had taught me to doubt myself. And I could choose to listen to it, or I could choose to let it go. So I let it go. Not all at once. Not easily. But little by little, with every interaction, with every conversation, with every mistake I made and survived. I let go of the belief that I was too old to learn. I let go of the belief that I was too broken to improve. I let go of the belief that my accent would forever make me an outsider. And what replaced those beliefs was something I didn't expect. Freedom. The freedom to speak without fear. The freedom to make mistakes without shame. The freedom to be exactly who I was, a woman learning a new language in a new country, rebuilding her life from the ashes of a failed marriage. That's what the mirror taught me, that the face staring back at me was not the face of a failure. It was the face of a fighter. A woman who had survived the worst and was still here, still trying, still believing that something better was possible. And that belief, as fragile as it sometimes felt, was enough. It was enough to get me out of bed every morning, enough to keep practicing. Looking back, I realized that the mirror didn't just show me my reflection. It showed me my potential. It showed me who I could become if I stopped running from my fears and started facing them. It showed me that I was stronger than I thought, braver than I believed, and more capable than I ever imagined. And that realization, as simple as it was the most powerful thing I ever learned. Because once you see yourself clearly, once you accept yourself fully, once you believe in yourself completely, there is nothing you cannot do. Not even learning English. Not even rebuilding your life. Not even finding love again. Nothing. So if you're watching this and you're struggling with English or with anything else, I want you to do something for me. Go to a mirror. Look yourself in the eye and say, I am enough. I am brave. I am worthy. Say it until you believe it. Because once you believe it, the rest will follow.
Trust me.
I know. Slowly, my broken English became my wings. There is a moment in every language learner's journey when something shifts. A moment when the language stops feeling like a foreign object and starts feeling like a part of you. A moment when the words no longer come from a place of fear, but from a place of freedom. That moment happened for me on a Tuesday. Of course it was a Tuesday. Tuesdays have always been significant in my life. I was sitting in my usual corner at the coffee shop, drinking my usual tea, and I realized I was understanding everything around me. Not just the words, the emotions, the jokes, the subtle nuances of conversation that had always eluded me. I was no longer translating in my head. I was just understanding. It was like a door had opened in my mind, a door I didn't even know was there. And on the other side of that door was a world I had always wanted to enter. A world where I could be myself. Where I could express my thoughts and feelings without fear. Where my broken English was not a liability, but a bridge. A bridge to connection. A bridge to understanding. A bridge to a life that was truly mine. I sat there, smiling like an idiot, and I felt tears streaming down my face. Not tears of sadness. Tears of joy. Tears of relief. Tears of gratitude. Because for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged. Not because I was fluent, not because I was perfect, but because I had finally stopped fighting the language and started embracing it. And in that embrace, I found something I had been searching for my entire life. Home. It was around this time that I stopped apologizing for my accent. I stopped apologizing for my mistakes. I stopped apologizing for being a learner. I started showing up as my imperfect, authentic self. And something miraculous happened. People didn't judge me. They didn't dismiss me. They didn't make me feel small. They welcomed me. They encouraged me. They saw me as a person, not as a project. And that acceptance, that unconditional acceptance, was the most healing thing I had ever experienced. It was proof that I didn't need to be perfect to be loved. It was proof that I was enough exactly as I was. I started to see my accent as a badge of honor, not a mark of shame. Every word I mispronounced was a reminder of the journey I had taken. Every grammatical error was a testament to my courage. Every pause was a moment of growth. I was no longer ashamed of my broken English. I was proud of it, proud of the struggles that had shaped me, proud of the resilience that had carried me through, proud of the woman I was becoming. And that pride, that deep, unshakable pride, gave me a confidence I had never known before. A confidence that spilled over into every area of my life. My work, my relationships, my sense of self. I was no longer a victim of my circumstances. I was the author of my own story, and I was writing it in a language that had once felt like my enemy, but was now my ally. I remember a conversation I had with my daughter around this time. She had asked me why I was smiling so much, and I told her, because I'm finally learning to fly. She didn't understand what I meant. She was too young to understand the metaphor. But I understood, and that was all that mattered. I had spent so many years grounded, weighed down by fear and shame and the belief that I wasn't good enough. But now I was rising. Slowly, painfully, imperfectly. But I was rising. And the wings I was growing were made of broken English. Every word I mispronounced was a feather. Every grammatical error was a muscle. Every conversation I survived was a gust of wind lifting me higher. I was no longer just surviving. I was soaring, and it was the most beautiful feeling in the world. I started to share my story, not to brag, not to seek pity, but to inspire, to remind others that they were not alone, to show them that if I could learn English, anyone could, to prove that broken English was not a weakness, but a superpower. A superpower that connected people across cultures, across borders, across languages. A superpower that said, I am here. I exist. I matter. I started writing. Not for publication. Not for fame. Just for myself. I wrote about my journey. I wrote about the pain and the joy and the everything in between. I wrote in English, with all its imperfections, because that was the language of my new life. And in writing, I found my voice. Not the voice I had lost, but a new voice. A stronger voice. A voice that knew its worth and was not afraid to speak. A voice that could move people, inspire people, change people. And that voice, as imperfect as it was the most beautiful thing I had ever found. One day, my daughter came home from school and told me that her teacher had read one of my stories to the class. She said the teacher had cried. She said the teacher had told the class that my story was a lesson in courage, in resilience, in the power of never giving up. And I felt a surge of pride so intense that I thought my heart would explode. Not because I had written something beautiful, but because I had inspired someone. Because my broken English had touched a heart. Because my story had made a difference. And that, I realized, was the true power of language. Not to impress people with fancy vocabulary or perfect grammar, but to connect with people on a human level. To share our struggles and our triumphs. To remind each other that we are not alone. That we are all fighting our own battles. That we're all trying to find our way. And that our voices, no matter how imperfect, have the power to change the world. I continued to write. I continued to share. I continued to speak, even when it was hard. And with each word, I grew a little stronger, a little braver, a little more free. I was no longer afraid of my accent. I was no longer ashamed of my mistakes. I was no longer hiding from my own voice. I was embracing it, celebrating it, using it. And in doing so, I was building a life that was truly mine. A life of purpose. A life of connection. A life of joy. So if you're watching this and you're struggling with English or with anything else, I wanted to know something. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Your imperfect, broken, beautiful voice matters more than you know. Don't be afraid to use it. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to be imperfect. Because that imperfection, that brokenness, is what makes you human. And being human is the most powerful thing you can ever be. So go ahead.
Speak. Share. Shine.
Your wings are waiting. All you have to do is fly.
Trust me.
I know. A stranger saw my worth. I had convinced myself that love was no longer for me. After the divorce, after the years of feeling broken and invisible, I had built walls around my heart so high and so thick that I couldn't imagine anyone ever climbing over them. I told myself I was too old, too damaged, too busy with my children and my English and my survival to even think about romance. But the universe, as it often does, had other plans. It happened at the coffee shop, the one I had been going to for months, the one where I had learned to listen, to absorb, to find my voice in the quiet corners of my own mind. I was sitting in my usual corner, drinking my usual tea, when a man walked in. He was tall, with a kind face and a gentle smile. He ordered a coffee and sat down at the table next to mine. And for some reason, I couldn't stop looking at him. Not because he was particularly handsome, not because he was anything special, but because there was something about him that made me feel safe. Something in his eyes that said, I am not a threat. And in a world where I had learned to be constantly on guard, that feeling of safety was intoxicating.
We didn't talk that day. I was too shy.
Too scared. Too convinced that he wouldn't want to talk to a woman with broken English and a complicated past. But he came back the next day. And the next. And the next. And each time, he would sit at the table next to mine, order his coffee, and smile at me. Not a creepy smile. Not a condescending smile. A genuine smile. A smile that said, I see you. I notice you. And I'm glad you're here. And I found myself looking forward to his visits. I found myself dressing a little nicer, sitting a little taller, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would finally say something to me. And then one day, he did. He walked over to my table and said, I see you here every day. You always look so peaceful. I'm wondering what you're thinking about. And I froze. My heart started racing.
My palms started sweating.
The familiar panic was rising in my chest. But then I took a breath and remembered everything I had learned. I remembered that my voice mattered, that my broken English was not a weakness, but a bridge, that I had nothing to lose by being myself. So I looked up at him and said, "I'm thinking about how much I've changed since I started coming here. I used to be so afraid.
But now,
I'm not afraid anymore. Not the way I used to be." Simple words.
imperfect grammar.
But they were my words, and he understood them. He smiled and said, "That's beautiful. Change is beautiful. Fear is just a sign that you're growing." And we started talking, not about anything important,
About the coffee.
about the weather, about the book he was reading. But it was a conversation, a real conversation. And I didn't freeze. I didn't run away. I just talked, made mistakes, and moved on.
And he didn't judge me. He didn't correct me.
He just listened. And that was enough. We started meeting every day. We would sit in the coffee shop for hours, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his life, his work, his dreams. I told him about my divorce, my children, my journey with English. And he listened. He really listened. He never made me feel like my English was a problem. He never made me feel like I was less than him because I couldn't speak perfectly. He just accepted me as I was. Broken sentences and all. And that acceptance, that unconditional acceptance, was the most healing thing I had ever experienced. It was proof that I didn't need to be perfect to be loved. It was proof that I was enough exactly as I was. One evening, we were sitting on a park bench, watching the sunset, and he turned to me and said, "I love you." And I froze. Not because I didn't feel the same way.
I did.
I had fallen in love with him weeks ago, but I didn't know how to say it back. I was afraid of getting the words wrong. I was afraid of ruining the moment. I was afraid that my broken English would somehow make the words less true. But then I looked into his eyes, and I saw the same fear, the same vulnerability, reflected back at me. And I realized that love transcends language. It transcends grammar. It transcends pronunciation. It transcends every mistake I could ever make. So I took a breath and said the words, exactly as I had practiced them in my head 1,000 times. "I love you too." Simple. Imperfect.
Perfect.
And he kissed me, and the world melted away. And in that moment, I knew that I had finally healed, not because I had found love, but because I had found the courage to be loved. I had found the courage to be seen with all my imperfections and to trust that I was enough. He met my children a few weeks later. I was terrified. What if they didn't like him? What if they felt like he was replacing their father? What if my English wasn't good enough to explain this new chapter in our lives? But my fears were unfounded. My children adored him. He was patient with them, kind, funny. He played games with my son. He helped my daughter with her homework. He was the father figure they had been missing, not because he was replacing their dad, but because he was adding something new to their lives. And my children, in their innocent wisdom, accepted him without reservation. They didn't care about his accent or his background or any of the things that adults worry about. They just cared about how he made them feel. And he made them feel loved. And that was enough. Our relationship grew deeper, stronger, more beautiful with each passing day. We talked about everything. Our hopes, our fears, our dreams. And my English continued to improve, not because I was trying so hard, but because I was finally living in the language. I was no longer a student of English. I was a speaker of English. I was a lover in English. I was a mother in English. I was a friend in English. The language had become a part of me, not through force, but through love. And that love, that beautiful, unexpected love, had healed me in ways I never thought possible. I realized something during this time. The man I had fallen in love with didn't love me despite my broken English. He loved me because of it. Because my broken English was a testament to my courage, a testament to my resilience, a testament to my willingness to try, even when things were hard. He said to me once, "Your English is the most beautiful English I've ever heard. Because every word you speak is a word you fought for. Every sentence you say is a sentence you built with your own hands. And that makes it more valuable than any perfect sentence in the world." And I cried, because no one had ever said anything like that to me. No one had ever made me feel like my broken English was something to be proud of, not something to be ashamed of. And in that moment, I knew that I had found not just a partner, but a kindred spirit. Someone who understood that language is not about perfection. It's about connection. It's about courage. It's about showing up as your authentic self, even when that self is imperfect. And that is the most beautiful thing in the world. So if you're watching this and you're struggling with English or with love or with any of the other challenges that life throws at you, I want you to know something. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of acceptance. You are worthy of being seen, not despite your imperfections, but because of them. Because your imperfections are what make you human. And being human is the most beautiful thing you can ever be. Trust me. I know. I found my voice in America. The parent-teacher conference was scheduled for 4 p.m. on a Thursday. I had been dreading it for weeks. Not because I didn't care about my children's education. I cared more than anything. But because every parent-teacher conference before this one had been a humiliation. A reminder of my inadequacy. A moment when I had to sit in a tiny chair, nod and smile, and pretend to understand conversations that were way over my head. I remember the first one. My daughter was in kindergarten. I sat across from her teacher, a kind woman who spoke slowly and clearly, but I still couldn't understand half of what she said. I nodded and smiled and said yes to everything, even when I had no idea what I was agreeing to. I left that conference feeling like a failure, like I had failed my daughter, like I had failed as a mother, and I carried that shame with me for years. Every conference was the same. I would sit there, silent and invisible, while the teacher talked about my children's progress. I would nod and smile and pretend to understand. And then I would go home and cry, not because the teachers were mean. They were always kind, but because I was so ashamed of my inability to advocate for my children, so ashamed of my silence, so ashamed of being the mother who couldn't speak English. But this conference was different. This time, I had prepared. I had practiced. I had spent weeks rehearsing what I would say, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to be a real parent. A parent who could stand up for her children. A parent who could ask questions and demand answers. A parent who could be heard. I walked into the school, my heart pounding, my palms sweating. I sat down in the tiny chair across from my daughter's teacher, and I took a breath. And then I spoke. "Thank you for meeting with me. I want to talk about my daughter's progress. I also want to talk about her confidence. She is smart. She is capable, but she is shy. She is afraid to speak in class. I think she is afraid of making mistakes, just like I used to be. I want to help her, but I need your help too. Can we work together?" I said it all in English, slowly, imperfectly, with mistakes, but I said it. And the teacher looked at me with such respect, such admiration, that I almost cried. She said, "Thank you for sharing that. I didn't know. I will make sure to encourage her more. And I will give her opportunities to speak in class without fear. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being her advocate." And I walked out of that school feeling like I had just climbed Mount Everest, because I had done it.
I had spoken for my child.
I had used my voice, and I had been heard. Not perfectly, not fluently, but I had been heard. And that was all that mattered. That moment changed everything for me. It was the moment I realized that I had finally found my voice in America. Not because I was fluent, not because I was perfect, but because I was brave enough to speak, even when I was terrified. Brave enough to make mistakes, even when I was ashamed. Brave enough to show up as my authentic self, even when that self was imperfect. And that bravery, that willingness to try, was the most powerful thing I had ever discovered. It opened doors I never knew existed. It connected me to people I never would have met. It gave me a sense of purpose I had been missing for years. I was no longer just surviving in America. I was living in America. I was thriving in America. I was finding my place in this country, not despite my broken English, but because of it. Because my broken English was a sign of my courage, a sign of my resilience, a sign of my refusal to give up. And that, I realized, was something to be proud of, not something to be ashamed of. I started to share my story with others, not to brag, not to seek pity, but to inspire, to remind others that they were not alone, to show them that if I could find my voice, anyone could. I started volunteering at the community center, helping other immigrants learn English. Not as a teacher because I didn't feel qualified, but as a mentor, as someone who had been where they were, as someone who understood their fear, their shame, their struggle. I would sit with them, listen to their stories, and share my own. I would tell them about the coffee shop, about the mirror, about the stranger who saw my worth. I would tell them that it gets easier, that the fear doesn't disappear, but it becomes manageable, that the mistakes don't stop, but they become funny, that the journey is hard, but it's worth it. One woman came to me, barely able to say her name in English. She was terrified. Her eyes were filled with the same fear I had felt. And I sat with her, just like my children had sat with me, and I said, "You are braver than you know. You are stronger than you think. And you're not alone." And over the weeks and months, I watched her transform. I watched her confidence grow. I watched her English improve. And I felt a deep, profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. The divorce, the pain, the struggle. It had all been worth it, because it had made me who I was. A woman who could help others. A woman who could inspire others. A woman who had learned that survival is not the goal. Living is the goal. And living, truly living, is a choice we make every single day. I started to think differently about the future. Before, the future had been something I feared. Something uncertain. Something I had to survive. But now, the future was something I looked forward to. Something I was excited about. Something I was building, step by step. I had plans. I had dreams. I had goals. Not just for my English, but for my life. I wanted to travel. I wanted to write. I wanted to keep learning, keep growing, keep becoming. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that I could do all of those things. Not because I was perfect, not because I had all the answers, but because I had something more important. I had courage. I had resilience. I had the willingness to try, to fail, and to try again. And that was enough. That was more than enough. I also started to realize that living, truly living, meant embracing all of who I was. My Vietnamese heritage, my American life, my broken English, my imperfect past. They all had shaped me into who I was. And I was proud of that person. Not despite her imperfections, but because of them. Because they were evidence of her journey. evidence of her strength, evidence of her refusal to give up. And there was nothing more beautiful than that. So if you're watching this and you're struggling with English or with divorce or with any of the other challenges that life throws at you, I want you to know something. You are not alone. You are not weak. You are not a failure. You are a human being doing the best you can with what you have.
And that is enough.
That is more than enough. That is everything. And one day, you will find your voice. Not because you become fluent, but because you become brave enough to speak, even when you're terrified. And that bravery, that willingness to try, will set you free.
Trust me.
I know. I found my voice in America, and it changed my life forever. My story helps you learn. My broken English became your wings. I used to believe that my broken English was my greatest weakness. I thought it made me invisible. I thought it made me unworthy. I thought it made me a failure. But I was wrong. So incredibly wrong. My broken English was not my weakness. It was my strength. It was my badge of honor. It was the proof of everything I had overcome. Every mistake I made was a step forward. Every mispronunciation was a victory. Every imperfect sentence was a testament to my courage. And now, as I look back on my journey, I realize that my broken English didn't just help me find my voice. It helped me find myself. It helped me rebuild my life from the ashes of my divorce. It helped me connect with my children, with my community, with the world around me. It helped me become the woman I was always meant to be. A woman who is not afraid to speak. A woman who is not afraid to make mistakes. A woman who is not afraid to be imperfect. And that, my friend, is the greatest gift I could ever give myself. But here's the thing. My story is not just about me. It's about you. The person watching this video right now, wondering if you'll ever get there. Wondering if you'll ever stop translating in your head. Wondering if you'll ever feel confident enough to speak without fear. I'm here to tell you, you will. Not because it's easy. Not because it happens overnight. But because you are braver than you know. And because every single time you try, even when you fail, you are one step closer to the person you are becoming. Think about it. When I arrived in America, I couldn't say a single word to the customs officer. I couldn't order a cup of tea without sweating. I couldn't have a conversation without feeling like I was drowning. But I kept going. I kept trying. I kept making mistakes. And eventually something shifted. The fear didn't disappear, but it became manageable. The shame didn't vanish, but it stopped controlling me. The mistakes didn't stop, but they became funny. And I realized that the goal was never to become fluent. The goal was to become free. Free to speak, even when I was terrified. Free to make mistakes, even when I was ashamed. Free to be myself, even when that self was imperfect. And now, I'm not just surviving in English. I'm thriving in it. I'm laughing in it. I'm loving in it. I'm living in it. And I want that for you too. I want you to know that your voice matters. Your story matters. Your imperfect, broken, beautiful voice matters more than you know. Don't be afraid to use it. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to be imperfect. Because that imperfection, that brokenness, is what makes you human. And being human is the most powerful thing you can ever be. I've learned so much on this journey. I've learned that language is not about perfection. It's about connection. It's about courage. It's about showing up as your authentic self, even when that self is imperfect. I've learned that mistakes are not failures. They are steps forward. They are evidence of growth. They are proof that you are trying. And trying is the only way you'll ever improve. I've learned that your accent is not a liability. It's a badge of honor. It's a reminder of where you come from. It's a testament to your courage. And I've learned that you are enough. exactly as you are. Not because you are perfect, but because you are trying, because you are growing, because you are becoming. And that is the most beautiful thing in the world. So let me leave you with this. Your broken English is not something to be ashamed of. It is something to be proud of. It is the evidence of your journey. It is the proof of your courage. It is the wings that will carry you to places you never imagined. And it is the bridge that will connect you to people you never would have met. So use it, speak it, share it, and you deserve to live a life that is truly yours. My story helps you learn, not because I am a teacher, but because I am a fellow traveler, a fellow learner, a fellow human being who has walked the same path you are walking. And I want you to know that you are not alone. You are not weak. You are not a failure. You are brave. You are strong. You are capable. And you have everything you need to succeed. All you need is the courage to try. And that courage, my friend, is already inside you. You just have to find it. So go ahead. Speak. Make mistakes. Laugh at yourself. And keep going. Because one day, you will look back on this moment and realize that it was the moment everything changed. The moment you stopped surviving and started living. The moment you found your voice and used it. The moment you became exactly who you were meant to be. And when that moment comes, I hope you will remember the story. I hope you will remember that you are not alone. I hope you will remember that your broken English is not a weakness. It is your strength. It is your wings. And it is the thing that will set you free.